Welcome to Science Matters Colorado, the podcast that explores the environmental issues shaping our beautiful state. I am your host, Alex Sippenhammer. For today's episode, I am thrilled to share an interview with Colorado-based author Ben Goldfarb. Ben has written for pretty much every publication you can think of, including The Atlantic, Science, The New York Times, National Geographic, and Outside, to name a few. Today's conversation focuses on Ben's book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers, which received the Penn E.O. Wilson Award in 2019. If you aren't familiar with Ben's writing, I recommend picking up Eager for your next read as a great introduction to his work. For anyone living in North America, it will completely change how you think about the history of our continent and what it looked like 300 years ago. We also talk about Ben's new book, Crossings, how road ecology is shaping the future of our planet. In addition to being named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, it also won the Sierra Club's Rachel Carson Award for Excellence in Environmental Writing. Crossings, like Eager, paints a historical narrative of the ecology of our continent by focusing its lens on one particular topic, roads and their environmental impact. Road ecology is a term that most people probably aren't familiar with, but once you dive in, it will likely ride shotgun on your daily commute. A few topics that we address in this conversation include the impacts of beavers on river ecosystems, grassroots solutions to environmental challenges, wolves in Yellowstone, the history of the term road ecology, the importance of culverts, fish migrations, and a lot more. Ben is a great speaker with an incredible vocabulary who distills complex science into compelling narratives. He also connects the dots between the history of our relationship with the environment and environmental movements taking place at various scales around the globe. One thing that I appreciate about Ben is that he doesn't sugarcoat these issues, but he also is a pragmatic optimist, always tuning into scalable, community-based solutions to tackle these environmental challenges. So whether or not you are familiar with Ben's work, I think you will enjoy this conversation. Well, the first time I was introduced to your work was you gave a talk at I think it was the Dairy Arts Center up in Boulder,
right?
About Eager and beavers. That wasn't actually that long ago. That was maybe just, a year and a half or 2 years ago?
A couple of years ago, yeah. It's a cool space, yeah.
Yeah. And then I read Eager after that. And then I'm still working my way through Crossings. I just finished the chapter about Australia and Tasmania.
Cool. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So you're most of the way through. You're far enough into that book that we can have a conversation about it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I want to talk about both today. I feel like that's a lot to tackle, but I think we can briefly touch on both topics. But to start, can you introduce yourself and give your own background a bit?
Sure. My name is Ben Goldfarb. I'm an environmental journalist and author. So I write books and articles about ecological topics, mostly conservation biology, wildlife management, that sort of thing. I write for places like National Geographic and The Atlantic and The New Yorker. I'm the author of a couple of books that I think we'll talk about today. One, Eager, which is about beaver restoration, very timely here in Colorado. And the other is about the field of road ecology. That's Crossings, the book you mentioned, how roads interact with nature and what we can do to kind of mitigate some of the negative interactions that our transportation infrastructure has on the natural world. I live down in Salida, and it's an awesome place to be and an awesome place from which to cover the issues that I tend to write about.
Do you have any beavers in Salida?
Oh, do we ever, Alex? Yeah, it's a beavery spot for sure. I mean, there's unfortunately it's beavery. Unfortunately, the main beaver colony that was really in town, there was a a beaver colony at a state wildlife area just outside of town. It was a 5-minute drive away. Those beavers were super active. They were the most reliable beaver viewing in Salida. Those beavers, unfortunately, are no longer. I actually found a carcass last year. I'm not sure what got it. Probably a human. And now those guys are gone. But all of the little mountain streams in Chaffee County, kind of around Salida, are all packed with beavers. Pass Creek, Greens Creek, Trout Creek, all beaver filled for sure.
What's the chances if I go to one of these places that I'll actually see a beaver like in action?
The chances are very slim.
Okay.
Beavers are generally nocturnal. They're really, you might say that they're also crepuscular. They're kind of out there at dawn and dusk working away. So if you found an active beaver complex and showed up right at sundown, there's certainly a chance that you might bump into the animals in the flesh. But for the most part, they're doing their work after dark.
Yeah. I have a confession. I don't know that I've actually seen like a beaver in the wild in person.
Oh, man, we got to rectify that. Come down to Salida. We'll go on a beaver quest, Alex.
That sounds fun. That'd be awesome. So going back to your own kind of history with this topic, what got you interested in beavers in the first place to the point that you decided to write a whole book about them?
Yeah, I'd always liked beavers. I had this kind of baseline affinity for them. I actually grew up in New York State and spent a lot of time hiking and camping with my family in places like the Catskills and the Adirondacks, pretty beavery parts of New York State. So I certainly around these animals. I have this, a couple of early beaver memories of beavers' tails slapping at me on various lakes while canoeing, and seeing them while I was fishing. If you do a lot of fishing, which I do, you're inevitably going to bump into beavers. So I always thought that they were kind of these cool, fun critters. And then my sort of full conversion to beaver believer happened in 2015. I was working for High Country News, great environmental magazine based in Colorado. At the time, I was living in Seattle, covering the Pacific Northwest as a correspondent for HCN. And somebody sent me a flyer for a beaver workshop that was happening just outside Seattle. And I had no idea what a beaver workshop was or what that entailed, but it sounded like it could be a fun story. And I like beavers, so I went to this workshop, and it was just life-changing. It was one scientist after another getting up to say their piece about why beavers and beaver ponds and wetlands were so important for water supply and water quality and fish habitat and fire mitigation and pollution filtration, all of these ecological benefits and services that beavers provide. And I sort of realized that, beavers aren't just this, cute, fun, interesting rodent that I kind of grew up with. They're actually one of the primary architects of North American landscapes, and they're also one of the primary ecological solutions that we can help deploy. We can help bring these animals back and not totally solve our problems, but at least begin to address them. So it was that workshop that turned me into a beaver believer and ultimately led to the book.
So when it comes to kind of framing this topic in terms of what the threshold is for successful beaver reintroduction, or for kind of like where we want to be in terms of like how many beavers do we want to see in Colorado or in the United States in general. A lot of your book, Eager, you spend on talking about the history of the continent and the history of the fur trade. Why is that history important for how we think about beavers and how we think about this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's important to consider that history because we need to establish some kind of baseline, right? When you said, very rightly, okay, how do we know how many beavers we want here in Colorado? And I think that, to begin to answer that question, we have to know approximately how many beavers we had in the first place, and we don't know that yet. Although there are certainly people like Sarah Marshall with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program who are working on estimating the number of beaver ponds in Colorado and how many the landscape could theoretically support. But I think it's important to recognize that our beaver population here in Colorado and in North America writ large is at a tiny fraction of what it was historically, right? We don't know how many beavers, lived on this continent at the time of European arrival, but the best guess we have is that there were several 100 million beavers here, right? Just this wildly prolific animal, and you read accounts from early trappers and explorers and railroad surveyors, and just there are these incredible accounts of beaver created marshes and swamps that just go on for miles and miles and miles. The explorers crossing what is today Indiana describe not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers have just ponded everything up. I think it's indisputably true that especially here in the West, there are places that we think of as basically arid today that were these amazing lush green, blue, wet beaver complexes that we've lost. So today we have something like 10 to 15 million beavers in North America, which again, right, they're not an endangered species. They're not going to go extinct anytime soon. That sounds like a lot of beavers. But you start to think, how many beavers did we used to have? And there's no question that we're probably at ballpark 10 to 20% of our historic beaver populations, quite possibly even less than that. And I think that, that's certainly the case here in Colorado where, if you look at, so Sarah Marshall, this scientist with CHNP or CNHP, she's basically used satellite images to detect beaver ponds and dams from space. And she's estimated that there are about 80,000 beaver ponds in Colorado, something like that, which again, sounds like a lot. But, historically, maybe there were 800,000, right? So, I think that restoring this animal has to begin with acknowledging that, we're at a tiny fraction of its historic abundance.
Wow. 80,000 does seem like a lot. Those are like active beaver ponds where beavers are living currently in Colorado, is Sarah's estimate.
Well, we don't necessarily know that they're active, right? Because a beaver pond that's inactive, can still persist on the landscape, right? You see that a lot. The beavers leave the area.
Okay, I see.
But that dam can kind of remain in place for years until it is finally washed away by runoff. So we don't know how many active beavers there are. And it's important to note also that a lot of beavers don't have ponds, right? Here in the Arkansas River Valley where I live, right, there are plenty of beavers living very happily in the main stem Arkansas River, not building dams or creating ponds, just kind of burrowing inconspicuously into the banks. And those beavers wouldn't be necessarily counted by satellite imagery, right? So they're a hard animal to survey in a lot of ways.
Yeah. That's interesting that you mentioned Indiana. I actually grew up in Indiana.
Wow. So
and
you grew up in the footprint of former beaver ponds, yeah.
Yeah. As a lot of us did, apparently, just judging from, what you wrote in your book about, I think that there's one anecdote of during the Lewis and Clark expedition, that one of them wrote in their journal about just like the number of bogs they had to cross on a daily basis, almost, just how swampy the continent was. And that's a very different frame of reference than what we have today.
Yeah, I mean, Lewis especially, Lewis is a great naturalist, and he's describing seeing, beaver dams and ponds in every single tributary of the Missouri River that they go by, all the way up into the base of the mountains, right? So it's just, yeah, and as you say, in some places, I mean, they couldn't even really use those valley bottoms. They'd like walk along the ridge lines or stick to the big main stem rivers because beavers had just kind of rendered some of those little tributaries unnavigable.
I think that that's an important frame of reference the history of beavers in the continent and those kind of reference ecosystems that we've lost touch with. So I appreciate you bringing that history back to the forefront of your book. And one of the things that I've heard you say is how we have this idealized version of what a river should be that is very different from those reference ecosystems that were the norm before colonization. And I would like to hear you talk about that a little bit in terms of like what our view of what a river should look like it is now, compared to kind of your view based on how beavers create these different ecosystem services through how they build dams and inundate the land. And you know, how can we adapt that view? And also to push it a little further, like where is this feasible in Colorado? Because I think there's certainly plenty of public lands and wild areas where we could use more of that. But what are kind of like, in your view, the limitations of that?
Yeah, really good question. I think that to understand the difference between our historic reference points and modern conditions, as you I think really rightly allude to. I mean, one great place to see that is the headwaters of the Colorado River. In Rocky Mountain National Park, and last year I was up there writing an article about this big plan to restore the Kawanichi Valley. In kind of the southern end of the park. And there, the Colorado River is just, kind of a little slender, kind of meandering, sine waved shaped stream moving through this big valley. And I think that most people would look at that stream and say, oh, this is like what a stream should look like, right? It's just this, kind of, right, narrow, sinuous, really picturesque creek. And you start to wonder, well, okay, that's fine, but what did this place used to look like? And you can really see this both in historic aerial images and also in the landscape itself. So if you look at this huge Kawanichi Valley that the Colorado River just runs through the middle of, if you look closely, what you'll see is just old beaver dams everywhere, right? These kind of old berms, basically, on this dry, desiccated floodplain. And if you know what you're looking for, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of these beaver dams that at one time would have stretched wall to wall in this valley and created hundreds of ponds. And now it's just this kind of like, right, desiccated, flat expanse where, there are a few willows kind of hanging on for dear life, but they're mostly dead, and they've been overbrowsed by moose, and the beavers were trapped out, and then basically have been mostly unable to recover because there are just so many elk and moose in there, eating all the riparian vegetation because there are no wolves, right? Suppressing those large herbivores, and so I think that's a great example, right, of a place where today, again, there's a beautiful, picturesque stream, the headwaters of the Colorado River. I think most people would look at it and not see, an unfolding environmental disaster. But again, if it was there 150 years ago, there wouldn't even have been a discernible stream channel, right? That entire valley just would have been, again, wall to wall beaver dams and ponds and wetlands. So, the Park Service and a bunch of other partners are kind of in the process of trying to restore some of those historic beaver ponds. Today, there are a couple of, real beaver colonies in that area, but, still just a glimpse of what, that valley would have been like at one time.
Is a part of the goal here to restore what it used to look like in terms of having hundreds of those berms? Is that what you're describing? Is the process that they're taking on right now?
Yeah. So what the Park Service and Colorado State University and a bunch of, again, there are all these nonprofit partners as well, and what they're essentially doing is putting in, well, a combination of features. First, beaver mimicry structures, these kind of artificial beaver dams that are often called beaver dam analogs, although they come in all kinds of different sort of formulations. And basically those are, beaver, sort of simulated beaver dams. And, the issue there is that, for the few beavers that are still, in that stretch of the Colorado River, there's just not a lot of opportunity for them. There's not. I mean, what do beavers need, right? Beavers need riparian vegetation. They need willow and aspen and cottonwood. That's what they eat, right? They eat the inner bark of those trees, and they use the wood as construction material. And there's just not a lot of that stuff on the floodplain right now.
Okay.
Because of this combination of the loss. I mean, that's one of the challenges is that when you lose beavers, you don't have beavers irrigating that riparian vegetation, right? Beavers are sort of like farmers in a sense. They're growing their own food supply. So when you lose them, you lose that irrigation function. And then there's just, again, so much browsing by especially moose that it's really hard for those willows to regrow. So, because the beavers don't really have the material they need to build their own dams, these scientists and managers are going in to build these artificial beaver dams. And then they're also putting up what you would call exclosures, these big fences that basically fence off sections of the stream banks and the floodplain, just to give those willows a chance to regrow without being eaten by moose. So, are we ever going to get back to the point where, there are hundreds and hundreds of beaver ponds and the Kawanichi Valley is just wall-to-wall wetlands? Probably not. That's a hard state to achieve. But, can we, create, let's say, dozens of beaver ponds or simulated beaver ponds and store a lot of water and create a lot of great bird habitat and help fight fires? Yeah, absolutely. So you can still make progress without necessarily getting all the way back to that historic condition.
Right. That seems also like a very valuable goal in terms of not just restoring that ecosystem itself, but in terms of like serving as a reference ecosystem for people to see like, oh, this is more what these rivers used to look like. They were more meandering. They did have more, berms or dams that was able to irrigate the land around it. So, it wasn't, these stream banks weren't eroding. It wasn't just like flowing really forcefully, and it helps to kind of create all these ecosystem services like you're talking about. So that seems really useful in terms of serving as a different frame of reference from basically most of the rivers that we have here, all the rivers that we have here. And it seems like that work is happening in different places through different groups. It's not necessarily this concerted effort that's happening through, just the Park Service, but there's, NGOs and different groups that are trying to create like these beaver dam analogs in different places. I've heard about efforts to do that in Crestone. I don't know if they were able to successfully reintroduce beavers this summer, but I know that was their goal. So hopefully we can see that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the cool things about these projects, right? Is just how many different sort of user groups are engaged in them. That Kawanichi Valley restoration project I was talking about in Rocky Mountain National Park. There are some of the Grand County water managers are really interested in that project because that river is just carrying so much sediment, which is impacting downstream water quality. And guess what? One of the things that beaver ponds do is they filter out sediment, right? They slow the flow, and that allows all of those suspended solids to kind of settle out, and so downstream water quality is really improved. So you've got water managers who are engaged in this sort of work. You see groups like Trout Unlimited, angling groups, which I would say 10 years ago, viewed beavers mostly as the enemy. clotting up trout streams with dams and warming the water. That was, the sort of the I would say the false allegations against beavers.
Yeah,
and
that sounds incorrect.
Yeah, exactly. And now, now you see, so many angling groups, who are invested in beaver restoration because, guess what? Beaver ponds are really good at growing fish, right? So yeah, it's just, exciting to see all of these different segments of society kind of coming together around beaver restoration.
And my impression was that they actually cool the water. No?
Right, exactly. You're exactly right, Alex. So that's, again, a common misconception, right, is that beavers. So what do beavers do? Beavers build their dams, they create ponds. The ponds spread water out. There's more pond surface area being hit by the sun's rays. Doesn't that warm up the water? That's again a very common misconception, and we know that warming flows is bad for trout. But as you say, what beavers actually do at the scale of a watershed is they cool water off, right? Because when you get a beaver pond spreading out onto the floodplain, well, a lot of that water actually sinks into the ground. And it very gradually trickles downstream underground where it's cooling off, and then those cold, subterranean flows basically bubble back up through the bed of the stream. This hypereik exchange, as scientists call it, between surface water and groundwater, and that actually results in cooling of streams. So that ability to kind of mingle surface water and groundwater is, one of the really cool things that beavers do.
Yeah, that is really cool. I didn't realize that was the mechanism that that's how they cool the water. So that's really interesting to hear about. Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot here. You've talked a little bit about predators being important for kind of scaring off some of the ungulates that can deteriorate, like riverbanks. And then beavers also being an important part of that. And there's something that you write about in your book, which is this video that showed up on YouTube that was pretty popular in regards to the sort of ecosystem restoration that took place in Yellowstone National Park, right, after the reintroduction of wolves. So what, in your mind, what percentage of that restoration do you attribute to beavers versus wolves?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And look, everybody knows some version of the Yellowstone story, right? And that's, the Yellowstone story is part of what motivated wolf reintroduction in Colorado, right? Is that, the simplified version of the story is the wolves came back, they ate and chased away elk from the valley bottoms. That allowed the willow and cottonwood to recover, and that allowed the beavers to show back up, and stabilized the stream banks and created habitat for birds and so on, right? So I think there's plenty of evidence that story is incomplete in a lot of ways. There are lots of drainages in Yellowstone National Park that actually haven't recovered in the presence of wolves. Elk don't seem to change their behavior around wolves as in every instance as much as they were sort of hypothesized to. So it's a really complex story. It seems like there are some streams in Yellowstone that have seen these dramatic changes, and some that that really haven't, because they're just too degraded to really recover on a rapid time scale. But I would certainly, as your question is sort of alluding to, I think I would certainly argue that that the role of wolves gets maybe overstated and the role of beavers gets understated, right? That if wolves did anything in Yellowstone, or at least the primary thing that wolves did, is they allowed beavers to recover, right? And beavers, were ultimately maybe the main ecological actors in Yellowstone and certainly in lots of other places. And I think unbeknownst to a lot of people, even before wolf reintroduction in the 1990s, there was actually beaver reintroduction just outside Yellowstone National Park in the 1980s, and a lot of beavers made their way downstream out of the kind of the Beartooth Wilderness and into Yellowstone National Park. So it was that beaver reintroduction that nobody knows about that in some ways allowed wolf reintroduction to really have a big impact. So ultimately, yeah, I would say the Yellowstone story, like all stories in ecology, is more complex than it first appears. But certainly I think we should talk at least as much about beavers in Yellowstone National Park as we do about wolves.
Just as soon as you add those nuances, the story just loses some of its appeal, When, as soon as you bring in an ecologist and they're like, well, actually, there's several more variables we need to account for. That YouTube video would just not have as many views after that.
Right, that's certainly true. I feel like the nuance adds to the appeal of the story, not subtracts, but it definitely makes it harder to encapsulate in a 3-minute viral YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. For that particular format. Yeah, well, I want to shift gears, and it's hard not to throw a pun in here, but and talk a bit about road ecology. So, just to start off, I mean, I guess what is road ecology, and how long has this term actually been in use? This idea of road ecology, because I think you might have interviewed someone who maybe sort of created this discipline for your book Crossings. Is that right?
Yeah, that is true. And I think maybe to provide a little bit of connective tissue between the beaver topic and the road topic. I mean, here's so one of the things that I love about the story of beavers in North America is just how hidden in plain sight it is in a lot of ways, right? Like when you drive or hike or do whatever in Colorado, in all of these stream corridors and river valleys, you're standing on top of the world that beavers built in many cases without realizing it, right? And so bringing back beavers is really about recognizing the ways in which our landscapes have changed, mostly for the worse in a lot of respects, and what we can do to kind of restore those landscapes. And to me, one of the things that drew me to the topic of road ecology is it's likewise kind of a hidden story. I think we've got 4 million miles of road here in the U.S. We drive on roads every single day. And I think because roads are so ubiquitous and we use them so much, we don't really think about their environmental impacts, right? When you think about the big environmental crises facing us, you probably think about habitat loss and mega fire and climate change, and certainly all of those are huge problems. But there's literally nothing that we do that actually kills more wildlife directly than just driving around, right? And so in that respect, I think that was kind of for me as a writer, that was the segue between beavers and roads. It's just feeling like, part of what I'm trying to do as a writer is reveal these hidden ecological impacts that we don't think about as much as we should. So to your question about where road ecology comes from, and so road ecology is basically this relatively small, but I would say very fast growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways in which roads and really all of our transportation infrastructure just mess with nature, from roadkill, right, dead deer or elk by the side of the highway, which we've all seen, to habitat fragmentation created by roads, to the pollution from tire particles and microplastics and other stuff that our cars are throwing off, to the invasive species that enter ecosystems along kind of the gridded corridors we've created. Yeah, that discipline. I mean, in some ways, the field of road ecology is more than 100 years old. You can go back and read about people, biologists, kind of wringing their hands over cars, that when Model Ts were rolling off the assembly line. But the real coining of road ecology as a true discipline happens in the 1990s. Richard Foreman, an ecologist at Harvard University, has this very famous anecdote that he told me and that I retell in the book, where he's in his office one day and he's looking at this giant aerial photo of a forest with some students, and he's expounding on the different habitat types within the forest, and here's where the water runs, and here's why humans have built their houses where they have within the forest, and so on. And he's sort of looking at this picture, and there's a road running right through the middle of the forest. And he says, it's funny, we know a lot about everything in this picture, but we don't know a lot about that road, and how that's affecting the ecology of the forest. And so that's really where road ecology as a formal academic discipline comes from, is this sense that roads were having these huge environmental impacts, but we didn't necessarily know what they were or how to deal with them.
I think just to kind of understand the scope of this problem as it pertains to the US in Colorado, one of the statistics that you share in your book, and I'm not sure I remember the exact number, but I think it was something along the lines of the National Forest Service maintains 3 times the miles of roadways as any other government entity in the world. Is that right?
Yeah, the U.S. Forest Service is, you're right, the single largest road manager on Earth. There's something like 370,000 miles of Forest Service roads. So you could drive to the moon and most of the way back on Forest Service roads.
Hey, this is Alex here. I just wanted to interject since Ben was too kind to correct me on this point. I could not find any evidence to support my claim about the U.S. Forest Service managing 3 times the miles of roadways of any other entity. I think I heard that in a conversation prior to the interview and didn't fact check it. I did, however, find evidence to support what Ben says, that the U.S. Forest Service manages approximately 370,000 miles of Forest Service roads. And to put that in perspective, all U.S. highways, including state, interstate, and federal aid highways, total up to about 225,000 miles of roads. So substantially bigger than the amount of highway road miles that we have here in the United States. And so just to kind of understand some different aspects of road ecology, when you think about this problem in terms of roads that, like let's just say I-25, when you have pavement, when you have all this asphalt, I think and like you talked about, the habitat fragmentation, the kind of environmental externalities that come from this are a little bit more clear, a little bit more evident. But when you talk about a dirt road that's going through a national forest, it's maybe not as clear what the environmental impacts are of that. So what is the issue with having, these kind of like unpaved roads going through a national forest?
Yeah, really, really good question. A really important one, because you're right that, different types of roads are having really different types of impacts at different scales. And, you might think, right, a little dirt road and in let's say the Pike San Isabel National Forest, which is in my own backyard, what is that really doing to nature, right? It gets, two cars a day. It's not, people aren't hitting deer or elk. What's the big deal? And I would say, a couple of things. First, you often see these really big hydrologic impacts with those unpaved forest roads, right? And in the book I tell the story of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest in Idaho, which basically had this giant network of logging roads, and then one winter in the 1990s, you get this huge series of rainstorms that basically soaks the land, and all of those old dirt roads basically turn liquid, right? And all of that sediment just goes racing down the mountainsides, hundreds and hundreds of landslides, and all of that material just ends up, smothering trout and salmon habitat. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that all of those unpaved dirt roads they're having really big impacts on on water quality, on trout habitat. So there are lots of hydrologic issues that come with those unpaved roads. And then the other big one is just human access. And this is a tough one, because look, at part of the reason that, I live in Colorado, and I think most people live in Colorado, is, we like going up into the forests and recreating, right? I drive dirt roads into forests every single weekend. It's one of the great pleasures of life. But I think it's also important to recognize that where humans go, wildlife generally doesn't, right? And bears and bighorn sheep and all of these, and lynx, and all of these rare critters are basically avoiding us. And so when roads funnel us into nature, that's functionally a form of habitat loss. Or think about our boreal toads here in Colorado, right? Just a vanishingly rare amphibian, being wiped out by chytrid fungus primarily. I mean, how does that fungus spread? It spreads on the boots of human beings who are themselves spread by roads, right? So in that sense, I mean, all anthropogenic impacts are in some ways road impacts, right? The roads are how we get around the landscape, and and where we go, other species generally don't.
So the human vector component of roads is one of the biggest issues. It just transports us around.
Unfortunately, yeah. Look, I think that does allude to this, growing resource conflict in Colorado and in every Western state, right? Which is just like the impacts of human recreation on nature. I think we have this. We have this assumption that that hiking and cross country skiing and mountain biking, all of these non-motorized forms of recreation, are basically benign. But there's actually lots of evidence, kind of a parallel field to road ecology, recreation ecology. Basically finding that along near heavily used hiking trails, animals are much scarcer, and they're often much more nocturnal because they fear us during the day. And how do we get to all those trailheads? We drive there, right? So, in that sense, that the human vector issue, I think, is a big one. And it's hard to talk about because, all of us who love nature and love wildlife and love being outdoors, want to be good stewards, and we hike and bike and paddle because we love being in nature, but we also have to recognize, I think, that our presence in nature is fundamentally disruptive.
Right. So you mentioned boreal toads, and you spend a decent amount of time in the book Crossings talking about herps, which is reptiles and amphibians, and some of the groups of animals that are the most sensitive to this habitat fragmentation, because they, are sensitive to sort of fluctuations in their environment, and because they also, in the case of amphibians, rely on multiple types of habitats throughout their lives. So can you maybe talk about one example that you share in your book about people endeavoring to protect these species, and why should we care? Why, like, just to play devil's advocate, I mean, if we have, some toad that goes extinct, what is the cause for concern there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think it does get to, sort of a fundamental issue in road ecology and our management of transportation networks, is that we've done a lot, not enough, but a lot to help large mammals cross highways, right? Here in Colorado, we've got wildlife crossings, for deer and elk and pronghorn, on Highway 9 and Highway 160 and I-25, and we've got all of these wildlife crossings, which is great. And I'm glad we have those things. And in the book, I talk a lot about why building crossings for large mammals is so important, both for the mammals themselves and for driver safety, right? Nobody wants to hit a deer or an elk or a moose with a car. Hundreds of people around the country die in those crashes every year, and those collisions with large mammals cost us billions of dollars collectively in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and so on. So no wonder that CDOT, the Colorado Department of Transportation, and other state agencies around the country have really done a lot to try to prevent those collisions. The problem that I think your question is pointing to is that if you take an approach to wildlife crossing construction and wildlife mitigation that focuses primarily on driver safety and preventing those crashes with elk and moose, there are a lot of animals that get left out, right? Nobody's ever, totaled their car, hitting a long-toed salamander, right? But as we know, as you said, these are some of the most road endangered animals on Earth. In large part because those amphibians are migrating in their own right. They're moving between their upland forest habitats and their wetland breeding ponds, and there's often a road between those two habitats. So even walking, a few hundred yards, if you're a frog or a toad or a salamander, can be incredibly dangerous. And unlike an intelligent black bear, which generally knows to fear traffic, amphibians aren't the smartest animals in the world, and so they get crushed in huge numbers. I mean, why should we care about that? To me, I think that's like, I just have a hard time answering that question, because caring about that, I think, is like so fundamental to who I am and to who a lot of people are, right? That, like, as E.O. Wilson put it, humans have this innate biophilia, this love of nature and wildlife, and I think that caring for and protecting those those small vulnerable critters is just part of loving nature and being responsible for this planet that we've kind of been entrusted by evolution. So I don't have a great answer for why we should care, other than that all species are I think beautiful and valuable and important in their own right, apart from any sort of anthropogenic purpose they serve. So anyway, there are lots of cool examples out there about communities kind of coming to care for these critters. Not nearly enough examples, but we're working on that. I mean, one story that I tell in the book that I've always thought was powerful was this guy Matt Oresco in Florida. One day he was kind of, I guess he heard about this turtle crisis where there were these two lakes that were separated by a highway. One lake was basically drying up, and hundreds and hundreds of turtles were basically fleeing the drying lake, trying to get to the adjacent lake, and just being slaughtered on the highway. And so he spent months and months basically moving turtles by hand, picking them up and collecting them in these big Rubbermaid storage containers and carrying them through traffic to the lake that still had water in it, and saved thousands and thousands of turtles, and ultimately mobilized this huge international coalition of turtle lovers to write letters to the Florida Department of Transportation and convince them to build a culvert, an underpass connecting these two lakes so that turtles could safely walk between them. And to me, I mean, that's just is incredibly illustrative of the fact that people are just, I think, innately driven to care about these animals. We see vulnerable creatures, and I think on some level we just instinctively want to help and protect them.
Yeah, and part of why I asked that question, and kind of the devil's advocate question about why should we care, is I've had that question posed to me more than once recently.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of curious how you'd answered it. And I think that there are a lot of cultural biases and assumptions that, are kind of just built into how we grow up, our childhood. If you're someone who's your family went camping and you spent time outdoors, and you're kind of taught to value those things, and that's kind of built into you. And there's a lot of cases where that's not the case. So I think people, it's an interesting question just to kind of think about what are our underlying values and why. And I definitely am someone who, similar to you, is just sort of instinctively like, well, how can you not care? But it's a difficult question to parse. So
Right.
I was just curious what you would say there. And yeah, that's a great example of a case where the kind of grassroots action led to some bigger reform. I also, when it comes to these issues, like you said, they're like these hidden issues that are kind of just very pervasive and seemingly intractable in a lot of ways as well. And you don't shy away from the complexity or the difficulty of these topics. You actually really do an amazing job of addressing the complexity. But you also, find these examples like the one you just shared of people, organizing grassroots kind of endeavors to tackle these problems. There was an example of one in Oregon to modify culverts so that salmon could pass upstream.
Yeah.
For example, so I'm just curious, like in terms of your writing process, how much of this is like a very conscientious effort that you're making to balance the, hey, here are the challenges of this issue, and here's what's going well right now, and here's what's not, here's where we're kind of failing as a society, and how much of that is maybe just a reflection of your personality or just how you think about these topics in general.
Yeah. I think that we are obviously awash in negative environmental news. And that's understood. We're in a dark place as a as a society, right, and as a planet. Right, we're in the middle of a climate crisis and an extinction crisis and a habitat crisis. We're in the poly crisis, as some scholars have called it. And that's real, and it's dark, and but I also think that look, we have a pretty good handle on like what the problems are that face us, and I now I think it's I think it's been time to turn towards solutions, as of course a lot of environmental groups do, and I think that's one of the things that attracted me to the beaver story to begin with. Is that, hey, here is this one awesome rodent that's going to help us address a lot of these ecological crises through its engineering, and so in that sense, I think the beaver story is a really positive story, right? I mean, here's this animal that we basically annihilated, was on the brink of extinction at the end of the 19th century, and now it's not certainly recovered, but it's it's in a much better place than it was, and now there are all of these scientists and community groups and agencies that are committed to beaver restoration, and so to me that's just kind of a counter narrative, to a lot of the again, totally justified and founded negative environmental news that we're kind of hit with every day. The road ecology situation is a little bit different in that it's that book, I think, is in some ways, I don't want to say darker exactly, but it's a bit more of a problem book, in that yes, there are certainly lots of things we can do to mitigate our transportation infrastructure. We can build wildlife crossings for animals that have to safely navigate roads. We can, decommission and actually obliterate a lot of those old Forest Service roads we were talking about earlier. So, the solutions exist, but we also have 4 million miles of road, right? We're not going to, make all of them, sort of nature friendly on any kind of meaningful timescale. So that book is again, I think a bit more problem oriented. But I guess I'm always trying to balance the dark and the light, and also give people something to do, right? One of the really gratifying things from both of these books has just been hearing from, at this point, literally hundreds and hundreds of readers who have read these books and acted upon them in some way. I've heard from ranchers who stopped killing the beavers in their irrigation ditches, and biologists at state parks who built underpasses for frogs because they read crossings. There are many examples of positive action that have come out of these books, and that's incredibly gratifying to me, obviously.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's really amazing. One kind of theme or maybe motif that I noticed in your books is culverts. They're really really a big part of the kind of effort to mitigate beavers from flooding roadways, but also helping to restore like salmon habitat. And they're this interesting sort of like ecotone between the built world and the natural environment. So I think they're also an interesting example of just how in your writing you find these little wins that we can kind of tackle and scale in terms of our human infrastructure. And just so as a way to think about, how we approach natural resource management and ecosystem like rehabilitation on a systemic basis. So I'm curious. I kind of forget what my question was there. Because I kind of already addressed like a little bit about why they're important, but maybe you can talk more about like just why culverts, like why are they so important?
Yeah, I think for starters, it's just important to define what a culvert is, right? Because I often will poll people on social media, and not everybody's actually even heard of a culvert. So a culvert is just any conveyance for water underneath a road or a railroad track, right? You often see those corrugated metal pipes that funnel streams and wetlands beneath roads. Sometimes culverts are kind of these concrete rectangular structures, right? But any place that water is moving under a road is a culvert, unless it's a bridge, of course. So I'm just fascinated by culverts, I think, because again, I mentioned earlier that a lot of my work, I think, is about revealing humankind's hidden impacts on nature, and those culverts are a good example of that. We drive over dozens of culverts every single day, often not realizing that they're there, and yet every single one of those culverts is potentially an ecological problem, right? Often culverts are too small, so they kind of concentrate the flow of water and make it impossible for fish to swim upstream, through one of those pipes. I mean, it's fun to think about the Northwest, for example, where you've got all of these big mega dams that have certainly impeded salmon passage, but we've lost a lot. We've lost many more miles of salmon spawning habitat to these little inconspicuous pipes on the landscape, that underpin highways that, again, you don't even know are there. And yet, there are these huge blockages to aquatic connectivity. So I think that's what kind of gets me about culverts, is just how hidden they are, and also how easy they are to address, right? All you have to do really is tear out the old existing crappy culvert that's too small or dilapidated for aquatic animals to use it, and put in a bigger, better one that both allows fish to pass and also makes highways safer and more durable for human transportation as well. And so I think I'm looking for those sorts of multi-wins, opportunities to address, both human and non-human problems simultaneously. And I'm also looking for, easy wins in a sense. I mean, I think that, look, I don't really write explicitly a lot about climate change, not because I don't think it's important. I think it's tremendously important, and I think it, undergirds a lot of my work. But it's also an incredibly challenging problem to solve, probably our most challenging problem, right? And lots of brilliant writers and thinkers who I admire have spent their entire lives writing about climate change, and unfortunately we're in a worse place today than we were 10 years ago. Whereas culverts, I mean, again, if you can convince some state transportation official to care about replacing culverts, you can regain a lot of miles of aquatic habitat by just swapping out one small pipe for one slightly larger pipe, and that's a pretty easy win in some respects. And so for me as a writer, I think I'm looking for for kind of manageable problems where I think my work can really make a difference, right? I probably can't write a book that's going to convince the planet to switch to renewable energy. But, I probably can write a book that's going to, convince a bunch of landowners to stop shooting their beavers, and convince, some state DOTs to swap out a few culverts, right? So, I think that search for, for topics where, my work can really have an impact, topics that are at the right scale for me to, actually do something about. I think that's often what I'm looking for.
In terms of those easy wins, is there a genesis of your next book happening currently?
So I mean, I'm still in the culvert space, I guess, because I'm writing a book now about fish, and specifically fish movement and migration, and I think in some ways that pulls together a lot of the interests in my first two books. Of course, it's got the beaver books, interest in aquatic ecology and river restoration, and it's also got Crossings' interest in sort of animal movement ecology and the restoration of movement. But I'd say broadly the book's about fish movement as this keystone ecological and cultural force or process that we've screwed up in a million ways and are now trying to protect and restore and understand. And each chapter is set in a different place and is about a different species or group of species. I mean, there's the kind of the Colorado specific chapter is about the history of native and non-native trout in Colorado, because of course a lot of where fish move to is where we stick them, right? And we've kind of scattered rainbow and brown and brook trout all over the state of Colorado, with kind of enormous impacts on native cutthroat trout, and and that's made it really challenging to restore native cutthroat because we don't necessarily know where they're supposed to be, or we don't. I mean, in some cases, we don't even really know what they are, right? The greenback cutthroat, our state fish, was, very famously kind of misidentified for a very long time before, more sophisticated genetic techniques caused scientists and CPW to realize they'd been, restoring the wrong fish for literally decades. Wow. Which was quite a blow to that recovery program. So yeah, that's a lot of what the book's about is about our kind of understanding of where these animals are supposed to be and how to bring them back, and and also, I mean, again, I think to your question about amphibians earlier, why we should. I mean, why does it matter? If you show up to the Arkansas River and catch a European brown trout or a California rainbow trout instead of a native Colorado cutthroat trout, why do we care about that sort of thing? Should we care about that sort of thing? And what does it mean to make that a bigger part of our politics in some ways?
That sounds fascinating. I'm excited.
Thanks, man. I hope to rejoin the show.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to have you back after that comes out and I get a chance to read it. Do you have any local engagements planned for the near future in terms of like speaking events? I know I really enjoyed your conversation with Robert McFarlane a few months ago about his book Is a River Alive, and you interviewed him, and it was just such an engaging, thoughtful conversation, and I really, really appreciated that they put that on at the Botanic Gardens there. And I know you've done some of your own speaking engagements in the past. Do you have anything like that upcoming in the near future?
I actually don't. I have, my wife and I recently had a kid, which was really exciting, and so I'm kind of dialing back the. Thanks a lot, yeah. But I'm sort of dialing back the public speaking for now to concentrate on the new kit in our family's lodge. So yeah,
beautiful.
Hope to hit the streets again soon.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
You have a dog named Kit, right?
I do, yes.
Okay.
Now I've got our canine Kit and our child whose name is not Kit, but is our metaphorical Kit.
To say, oh no, did you go with Kit for your kid as well?
I know. I do kind of wish I'd saved the name though. That would have been should have saved the name for the baby instead of giving it to the dog.
Right. Where can people find out more about your work and what you're up to now?
Yeah, certainly. So my website is bengoldfarb.com, and I'm active on all of the social media platforms where people would ordinarily find authors, and my books are available at most of Colorado's wonderful independent bookstores. We're a state that's graced with a lot of fantastic bookstores. I mean, of course, you guys have Tattered Cover, but I also love, big shout out to my friends at Townie Books in Crested Butte and Paonia Books down in Paonia, and a bunch of, of course, Maria's in Durango, and all of those bookstores have been great supporters of my work over the years. So yeah, so if you want to get a book anywhere, get it at one of our state's awesome independent bookstores.
Awesome. I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, Ben. I'm looking forward to your next book, and congratulations on the new kit. It's really exciting. Glad you're
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for the conversation and all the great questions. I really appreciate it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Ben. If you enjoyed today's episode, the best thing you can do is like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Also, recommending it to a friend goes a long way. You can purchase Eager and Crossings from a locally owned bookstore near you, or follow the links in the description to find other purchasing options. The music for this podcast is Siesta by Ixon, part of this Tell Your Story project, a library of free music for content creators. Visit ikson.com to explore the full catalog.